I was surprised when I attended my first track day for a variety of different reasons, but one of the main things that surprised me the most was the type of bikes that I kept seeing around. Before I arrived, I kept imagining most people would be on supersport bikes like my 600 for instance, but I was wrong. By far the most common bike I saw there was the Suzuki SV650. And after talking with a bunch of people that owned and even raced the SV650, I finally got to understanding what is so special about this little Suzuki. So today I will be sharing my knowledge and newfound appreciation for this little 650 V-twin street bike by Suzuki. But before we dive into what makes the SV650 such a special little bike, we need to first know the history on how this bike came to be. The history of this little cult bike began all the way back in 1999, when the first generation SV650 was born. Suzuki created the SV650 as a budget-friendly middleweight street bike. It was offered in both a naked trim and a half-faired sport trim. The half-faired sport trim was known as the SV650S, whereas the naked iteration was just called the SV650. In addition to the fairings on the S model, it also featured lower bars, higher pegs, and a windshield. The SV650 features a 645cc 90-degree V-twin engine which pushes out just about 69 horsepower and 45.5 foot-pound of torque. The SV650 was lightweight at just 417 pounds and had a nice torquey engine. The power was described to make good torque from as low as 2,000 RPM all the way up to redline, which was at about 10,500 RPM. The power was consistent and you always had some torque available thanks to the 90-degree V-twin engine configuration. With a top speed of 131 miles per hour and a quarter-mile time of around 12 seconds, the SV650 was quite the performer. Oh, and 0 to 60 can be achieved in just around 3.7 seconds in case you were curious, thus making the SV650 a very good street bike given its instant torque, which can be fun and helpful on the street. The first generation SV featured two 39mm Mikuni downdraft carburetors. At the time, Suzuki still hadn't perfected their EFI setups, so the carbs were necessary. People love to complain about carburetors, but the carbs are mechanical and have some of the best throttle response you can get on a bike, especially during this era. So keeping them clean and dialed in correctly will give you a better riding experience than EFI of this era. Interestingly enough, the rear carb has a throttle position sensor which could actually be adjusted to change the ignition timing of your bike to tailor it to your needs. The SV650 also had a decent sized trunk and certain design elements were incorporated to make maintenance easier. For instance, the air filter can be removed with just a Phillips head screwdriver. Oh, and look at the oil filter location. Easy oil changes can be done in just a few minutes. Even the fuel tank can be propped up so it's easy to gain access to the top of the engine without having to remove the fuel tank. Average fuel economy was around 45 miles per gallon, giving the SV650 a range of right around 200 miles with a 4.5 gallon tank. Reliability is also very good. As long as you stay up to date with the maintenance, the carbs won't give you any problems. However, the first thing that will probably start giving you problems is the electronics. So expect to have to replace or upgrade the rectifier at some point if it hasn't been done already. But that's pretty typical for any 20-year-old motorcycle from this era. The engine is very understressed and doesn't have any major known issues. However, there are reports that in heavy rainstorms, rain can collect around the front spark plug and cause a misfire. Luckily, there are easy fixes for all of these issues, and with the SV being such a popular bike, any problem you run into has already been diagnosed, repaired, and documented by another owner. So searching the internet will most likely solve any problem that you could possibly have. The standard SV650 also has very nice friendly ergonomics, with the comfortable seat and upright bars meant you could ride all day. The seat height was very low at 31.7 inches, which meant that it was approachable for shorter riders as well. The front suspension at the same time was very budget, and by today's standards it's definitely lagging behind, with no adjustability and a bit on the soft side, and the rear shock wasn't much better, just featuring a 7-way adjustable spring preload and that's it. But even though the suspension is a bit of a letdown, the chassis certainly isn't. The aluminum truss style frame is not only very nice looking, but it is lightweight, while also being very rigid at the same time. Another benefit to the frame was the swing arm, and how they work together to make the wheelbase of the SV650 to 55.9 inches. The short wheelbase allowed the SV650 to flick over side to side very easily. The SV650 is also considered one of the most balanced motorcycles of all time, even in today's standards. The brakes were also adequate for the power of this bike, featuring two 290mm discs in the front with 2 piston calipers, and a single 240mm disc in the rear with a 2-piston caliper. The brakes overall were nothing great, but because of the lightweight of the SV650, they were more than adequate for the street, although track riders may want to look at possibly upgrading them. Oh, and it's worth mentioning that the tire sizes were 120 for the front and 160 for the rear. The first generation SV650 holds up so well even today. It's still being used. In fact, I saw some people racing them against 2020 bikes when I went to the track. Now that's pretty impressive for a 1999 middleweight budget bike by Suzuki. If you decide to pick up one of these bikes, I would say first dial in the carburetor to as perfect as you can get it, then start looking at upgrading the suspension. After that, you will have yourself a very well balanced budget track bike. Of course, there's always more to do, but that's where I would start. And in the year 2000, the SV650 saw no changes, except they changed the wheels from silver to black, and they added black as a color option. Also, the SV650S saw its way into the US. Previously, it was only sold in the Euro and Canadian markets. 2001 and 2002 were both quiet as well, as the SV650 was more or less the same exact bike, just some more color changes were made. And then in 2003, Suzuki finally started giving the SV650 some more love. The first generation was over after 4 years, and from its ashes bred the new second generation SV650. The main changes were an all-new pressure cast aluminum truss frame, which was no longer tubular but instead diamond-shaped with sharp angles. Interestingly enough, the frame was created using a new high vacuum mold process that makes the frame lighter and stronger with fewer imperfect welds. Using this method, Suzuki was able to control the wall thickness more precisely and tune the flex of the frame. Overall, the frame is considered to be about 5% stiffer than the previous model. Now, 5% might seem minimal to you, and that's because it is. The improvements Suzuki made were marginal at best, but they were technically still an upgrade. And although the frame didn't provide much improvement to the handling, the front suspension did get an update with 41mm standard forks that offered adjustable preload. It's also worth mentioning that the fork offset was changed a little bit as well, which increased the wheelbase from 55.9 inches to 56.7 inches. And the rear suspension got a slightly less spring rate, down from 510 to 430. That wasn't the only thing that affected the handling though, as along with these updates came some weight. And the second generation SV650 increased its weight from 417 pounds to 437 pounds. These weight changes were not insignificant. 20 extra pounds is an increase of about 4.8% over the first generation. As disappointing as it may be for some of you that the second generation did gain some weight, it's important to know that the weight may have actually been worth it, because by far the biggest change for the second generation is that Suzuki finally gave it electronic fuel injection, featuring secondary throttle valves which helped make the throttle smoother, a new cam profile, and increased muffler and airbox capacity for improved engine performance and fuel economy. Also, a new engine oil cooler was added, and new lighter engine internals were used, and all these changes gave a noticeable bump up in power as the second generation SV650 improved its horsepower from 69 to 73, and torque from 45 to 47. Unfortunately, those 4 extra horsepowers didn't manage to improve the top speed, 0 to 60, or quarter mile time by any substantial amount. I'm guessing the 4 extra ponies were not enough to overcome the 20 extra pound curb weight. The brakes were also not improved much, as they still featured a dual 290mm discs to the front with 2 piston calipers, while the rear brake features a 220mm disc, which oddly enough is 20mm smaller than the previous generation. Now I will note this, riders who have ridden both generations report that they didn't notice any difference in rear brake performance, so I guess the smaller disc just helps save a little bit of weight and cost to manufacture. As for the 4 extra horsepower, a lot of people that rode both the first and second generation actually say it is a noticeable increase in power when you are riding. So even though it doesn't show up in the spec sheet so much, maybe it's something you feel more when you're actually riding. Now again, it's only 4 horsepower on paper, but before you get disappointed with that number, there are still performance improvements, as the throttle response and power delivery were improved over the carburetor model in just about every single way. Torque is plentiful and the bike always feels responsive, and even though the numbers don't jump out at you, the second generation bike does feel like a faster bike. It's also important to note that electronic fuel injection is a nice quality of life upgrade, as it's less maintenance intensive than the previous generation model. And that makes sense too, as Suzuki made the SV650 to be an everyday bike that can do it all. Suzuki also changed up the gauge cluster, gone are the double round dedicated gauges for RPM and speedometer. Now it features a more modern looking digital speedometer, but they kept the traditional RPM needle, which is nice. The tail light got upgraded to an LED unit, and several other convenient features were added to the 2003 model, included hazard light and passing light switches, luggage tie-down hooks, as well as a passenger grab bar. Also, in case you didn't notice, the S edition still featured the half fairings and windshield with some cosmetic updates. Along with the wheelbases of the S is actually 0.4 inches shorter than the standard model. It has clip-ons instead of handlebars and a 44 rear tooth sprocket compared to the 45 tooth rear sprocket, which helps give it a little bit more top-end speed. And in 2004, Suzuki changed virtually nothing, except the subframe was lowered 40mm for increased passenger comfort and a more compact rear fender. The seat was also made a little bit narrower as well. It was said to be a little bit easier for short riders to handle so they can reach the ground easier. Oh, and the rear fender was changed up just a little bit. And in 2005, the color of the frame was changed from silver to matte black, and the radiator size was decreased from 440mm to 410mm. The standard model was also equipped with a meter visor that was color matched with the body parts. Also, the front brake cylinder head got a new style as well. And in 2006, we saw different colors. However, in 2007, Suzuki did replace the cylinder head to a new updated version that provided dual spark plugs per cylinder and an exhaust gas oxygen sensor on California models. This was almost completely done for emissions and fuel economy purposes. Power was not increased at all. And finally, Suzuki did add an anti-lock braking system as an option. And in 2008, Suzuki introduced the SV650 SF, which featured a full-size sport fairing. This was meant to replace the SV650S. Mostly everything else was the same except for the bodywork. And in 2009, the most significant thing happened in the SV650 history timeline. Suzuki decided it was time to kill off their beloved SV650. Suzuki replaced the SV650 with a new bike called the Gladius. Now, the Gladius is widely hated, considered not to be a real SV650 by most, and honestly, the purist had a point. The Gladius had no extra power, but did manage to gain 9 additional pounds, making it weigh around 446 pounds wet. Most of the extra weight was gained by changing out the aluminum tubular frame to a cheaper steel tube frame, while gaining no extra power and no real improvements to the suspension or braking as well. The instrumentation though definitely got an upgrade, as they've completely changed it to feature a gear indicator that is nestled right at the bottom corner of the RPM gauge. See, how bad could the Gladius really be if it has a gear indicator? The Gladius wasn't actually a bad bike. It got great reviews and overall was a good bike to roll around on. However, because it was replacing the SV650, it just had big shoes to fill, and the Gladius was heavier, less capable, and lacked all the soul and character the SV650 had. It was considered kind of a failure by Suzuki. Now, despite the Gladius hate, it was here to stay for a while. It ran through until the 2012 year when Suzuki finally decided to change the name from Gladius to SV650. But it was still a Gladius underneath, and that didn't trick the purists as well, as the market spoke and the SV650 still wasn't really selling that well compared to the original second generation SV650. Which is what prompted Suzuki to change everything finally in 2017 when they released the real successor of the SV650, the third generation SV650, which was appropriately called just the SV650 like the previous generation. No more Gladius or Gladius DNA, as the SV650 was its own bike again. The first thing Suzuki did was make this third generation SV650 go on a diet, as it came out only weighing 430 pounds wet for the non-ABS model and 434 pounds for the ABS model. That's a substantial improvement over the Gladius, and even an improvement over the second generation, which was 437 pounds, now down to 430 pounds. Its engine also developed an additional 4 more horsepower, bringing the total up to 75. Torque remained the same, right around that 47 foot-pound mark though. The third generation also featured a new low-speed stalling prevention system, also known as low RPM assist, to make the bike more suitable to beginner riders and easier to ride in stop-and-go traffic. Also making it even more street-friendly for shorter riders, as the seat height was decreased further to just 30.9 inches, which is extremely short. Suzuki was able to accomplish the shorter seat height by making the seat thinner on the sides. Unfortunately, this made the seat not as comfortable as the older generation. However, it was still overall a fairly comfortable bike for around town. And the third generation most importantly meets the Euro 4 emission regulations. And although the frame wasn't aluminum on this model either, it was a brand new slim steel frame that Suzuki used, which looked a lot better and was a lot lighter. The throttle bodies were updated to be slimmer and lighter at just 39mm. I also have to point out that the third generation has all the new updated instrument cluster, which features a gear indicator, digital speedometer, digital RPM gauge, as well as a fuel range display. Overall, the third generation was welcomed with open arms by some purists, as they breathed a sigh of relief as the Gladius was no longer haunting them. But the biggest change being that the frame is now steel and not aluminum was definitely a cost-saving technique by Suzuki, which is fine, but you will hear some squawking about that from some of the original SV650 cult members, and honestly myself as well. I don't know why Suzuki would not just keep on the aluminum frame. It's what kind of made the SV650 popular to begin with, was the cool looking frame from the first and second generation. And now that we are all caught up in the history of the SV650, I am going to wrap up this video with why it is a fantastic track bike. Actually no, it is actually just a plain fantastic bike in general. The SV650 is comfortable on the road, has plenty of features to make it much more approachable for newer riders or shorter riders, and it's extremely easy to live on a daily basis. The reliability of the SV650 is one of its strongest traits, as the original first generation models are still going strong even to today. Suzuki has built the SV650 to last, and it has stood the test of time. Not only that, but it is very affordable. Even in this crazy market, you can probably pick yourself up a second generation model for less than $3,000. Or you could always go and purchase a brand new 2022 model from Suzuki for just $72.99, making the SV650 an incredible value for what you are getting. I would also note that if you are buying a used SV650, whether it's the first gen, second, or even third generation, then you should be very careful to only pick up one that is running, and listen to the engine carefully and for any signs of it being stunted or wheelied. Unfortunately, the SV650 cannot handle long distance wheelies as well as other bikes, as the oil pickup tube is located towards the front of the engine, and a long wheelie will starve the engine of oil and destroy the engine. So be very careful when buying used. There is a ton of information online on people doing repairs and upgrades throughout all the generations, and because of that you will always have answers to just about any question you could ever ask regarding one of these SVs. The SV650 on the track is very manageable and easy to ride, a great bike to learn with. With its almost instant torque and relatively friendly 645cc V-twin motor, you can fly around the racetrack with confidence and have a great time, or you can even compete with other bikes in actual races. The SV650 is an extremely competitive bike with some modifications, of course, and when you crash it, it's easy to repair. When you want to replace anything on the bike, there's tons of parts available online and plenty of information on how to do it. The SV650 is just a rare bike in a sense that it does everything well, and honestly, I want one. So hopefully I'll get my hands on one soon and bring it to the track instead of my 600, because now I'm starting to understand why people track these bikes more than even super sports. Anyway everyone, that's the end of this video. Before we go here, I just want to ask all of you one question. When it comes to the track, what would be your bike of choice? Would you take an SV650 over a super sport like say a 600 or 1000? Now how about a Ninja 400 or maybe even a Supermoto? I'm very curious of what you guys think the best track bike would be, and I'd appreciate gathering all of that data from all of you down in the comment section below. Please let me know down below so we can keep the discussion going. Alright guys, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all have a great day. Ride safe, and remember, this little SV650 is quite a special bike.
It's a sick news, put your little arrows out. Let me live my life, the one I'd better lead. All the plans of fantasies, and we looked at them 11 ways. You said, look at me, I looked away, and you wrote the song I wanna play. Alright.